The theater was buzzing with noise, audience chatter, nervous contestants pacing backstage, and judges casually preparing for another routine audition. But no one expected what was about to happen next. Before we begin, imagine walking onto the biggest stage of your life with the weight of someone else's dream on your shoulders. If stories of courage and unforgettable moments inspire you, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because today's story will remind you that sometimes, one voice and one truth can stop the entire world. It was a bright evening on the stage of America's Got Talent. The judges sat behind their desk, Simon Cowell, Heidi Klum, Sofia Vergara, and Howie Mandel, ready to watch another audition. The next contestant walked slowly onto the stage. He was just 12 years old. His name was Daniel Reyes, a thin boy with slightly messy black hair and nervous eyes. He wore a simple white shirt that looked a little too big for him and faded jeans that had clearly been worn many times before. In his hands, he held an old brown folder. The audience immediately softened at the sight of him. Simon leaned forward slightly. "So Daniel," Simon said calmly, "what are you going to do for us today?" Daniel swallowed nervously. I'm here to sing," he said quietly. "How old are you?" Howie asked. "I'm 12. The crowd applauded encouragingly. Simon nodded. "All right, Daniel. Why did you come here today?" For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. He looked down at the folder in his hands. Then he said something that made the room go quiet. "My dad told me I'd stand on this stage one day." The judges smiled politely, assuming it was just another sweet story. But Daniel continued. "My dad said people would stop everything to hear the truth." Simon tilted his head. "What do you mean by that?" Daniel slowly opened the folder. Inside were several old papers and a worn photograph. "This is proof," Daniel said. The audience murmured with curiosity. Simon raised an eyebrow. "Proof of what?" Daniel took a shaky breath. "Proof that my dad was right." The room fell silent. Daniel explained that his father, Miguel Reyes, had been a struggling musician years ago. He had written songs his entire life but never had the chance to perform on a big stage. People always told him his dreams were unrealistic. But he never stopped believing. When Daniel was younger, his father used to sit beside him every night with an old guitar and say something Daniel would never forget. One day, his father would say, "You'll sing one of my songs on the biggest stage in the world. And when you do, people will finally listen." The judges leaned in closer. Simon folded his arms thoughtfully. "And where is your dad now?" he asked gently. Daniel's voice trembled. "He passed away last year." A soft gasp moved through the audience. Daniel held up the photograph. It showed a smiling man sitting with a guitar beside a much younger Daniel. "He wrote a song before he died," Daniel continued. "He told me to keep it safe, until the day I could bring it here." The entire theater was completely silent. Simon looked at the paper Daniel held. "You're saying your father predicted this moment?" Daniel nodded. "He said one day you would stop everything to listen." The crowd turned toward Simon. For once, the famously blunt judge didn't speak. He simply gestured to the stage. "All right, Daniel," Simon said softly. "Let's hear it." Daniel walked to the microphone. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper with his father's song written on it. Then the music started. The first note left his mouth softly, but perfectly. His voice wasn't loud or flashy. It was pure. Honest. Emotional. The kind of voice that makes people stop breathing for a second. The audience slowly leaned forward. By the second verse, people began wiping tears from their eyes. The lyrics told the story of a father watching his child grow, believing in him even when the world didn't. By the chorus, Daniel's voice grew stronger. And that was the moment something incredible happened. Simon Cowell raised his hand. The music stopped. The entire theater froze. Everyone stared at Simon. Contestants backstage held their breath. Simon Cowell had stopped the performance. Daniel's heart dropped. Had he done something wrong? Daniel looked down nervously. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Simon slowly stood up. Something no one expected. The audience went completely silent. Simon walked toward the stage, his expression unusually serious. Then he spoke into the microphone. "Daniel, how long have you been singing?" "Since my dad taught me," the boy answered. Simon nodded slowly. Then he said something that shocked everyone. "Your father was right." The crowd erupted in applause. Simon turned toward the audience. "I stopped the music," he explained, "because I wanted everyone here to understand something." He looked back at Daniel. "Your voice isn't just good. It's real." He pointed to the paper in Daniel's hands. "And that song, that's something very special." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Simon gestured toward the band. "Start from the beginning." The music began again. But this time, the entire audience was standing. Daniel sang with more confidence now, his father's words echoing through the theater. When he reached the final chorus, thousands of people were cheering. Even the judges were wiping tears from their eyes. Heidi Klum covered her mouth. Sofia Vergara clapped while shaking her head in disbelief. Howie Mandel smiled proudly. And Simon simply watched Daniel finish the song. The final note rang through the theater. For a moment, there was silence. Then the crowd exploded. A standing ovation. Thunderous applause. People shouting Daniel's name. Simon pressed his buzzer. The screen behind Daniel lit up. 3 giant glowing yes votes followed. Daniel covered his face in shock. But Simon wasn't finished. He looked at Daniel and said one final thing. "You didn't just prove your father right. You proved that dreams don't disappear, they just wait for the right voice." Daniel held the photograph of his father tightly. Looking up at the lights above the stage, he whispered quietly, "We did it, Dad." The audience applauded louder than ever. And somewhere in that moment, everyone watching realized something powerful. Sometimes the biggest proof in the world isn't a document. It's a dream that refuses to give up. And if this story reminded you that belief can change a life, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because the next incredible story might be even more unforgettable. The applause inside the theater slowly faded, but the energy in the room had completely changed. What had started as just another audition had turned into something no one expected. People in the audience were still standing, many wiping tears from their eyes. Daniel Reyes stood on the stage clutching the worn photograph of his father, trying to process what had just happened. Simon Cowell looked at the boy for a long moment. His expression had softened, something viewers rarely saw from him. "You know," Simon said slowly, leaning forward on the judge's desk, "we hear thousands of singers every year on America's Got Talent. Some are great, some are okay, and some are unforgettable." Daniel stood quietly, his hands still trembling. Simon continued, "But very few walk on this stage carrying something bigger than themselves." The audience clapped again. Daniel wiped his eyes, trying to stay calm. Howie Mandel leaned toward his microphone. "Daniel, that song your father wrote, did anyone else ever hear it before tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "No," he said softly. "My dad always said the right moment would come." The judges exchanged glances. Sofia Vergara smiled warmly. "Your father must have believed in you very, very much." Daniel nodded slowly. "He did," Daniel said. "Even when nobody else did." The audience grew quiet again. Daniel took a deep breath, and for the first time since stepping on stage, he began telling the story he had carried in his heart for years. "My dad worked at a small repair shop," Daniel explained. "He fixed old radios and guitars people didn't want anymore. We didn't have much money, but every night after work he would bring home broken instruments and try to fix them. The big screen behind Daniel showed the photograph he had brought. It was a simple picture, a father sitting in a small room with an old guitar, smiling proudly while his son sat beside him. "That was our living room," Daniel said quietly. "My dad called it our music studio." The audience chuckled softly. "He used to tell me something every night before we slept," Daniel continued. Simon leaned forward again, listening carefully. He would say, "Daniel, one day people will listen to your voice and understand something important, that believing in someone can change their whole life." Daniel paused. "But when I told people at school about his music, they laughed," he said. "They said my dad was just a mechanic pretending to be a songwriter." The crowd murmured with sympathy. Daniel lowered his head. "At first I stopped telling people about it," he admitted. "But my dad never stopped writing songs." He looked back at the paper in his hands. "Even when he was sick." The theater became completely silent again. Simon's expression changed slightly. "What happened to him?" Simon asked gently. Daniel swallowed. "He got very sick 2 years ago," the boy said. "The doctors said he had cancer." A soft gasp moved through the crowd. Daniel continued speaking, his voice steady but emotional. "Even when he was in the hospital, he kept writing songs. Nurses would hear him humming melodies while he rested." He smiled faintly. Sometimes the nurses would ask him to sing. The judges smiled. Daniel continued, "One night he called me over and gave me the paper you saw earlier." He lifted the worn sheet carefully. "He told me this was the..." The cheers from the audience still echoed through the halls of the theater long after Daniel stepped off the stage. Backstage was filled with producers, contestants, and crew members who had all watched the moment unfold on the monitors. Some of them were still wiping their eyes. It wasn't just another audition anymore. Everyone could feel that something bigger had happened. Daniel stood quietly near the curtain, still holding the photograph of his father. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming realization that the promise he made to his father had finally reached the stage he had dreamed about. His mother rushed toward him and wrapped him in a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Daniel hugged her back tightly. "Dad was right," he said softly. Behind them, several producers from America's Got Talent were discussing what had just happened. Moments like this were rare even for a show that had seen thousands of performers over the years. One of the producers said quietly, "That boy just created one of the most powerful auditions we've ever seen." Meanwhile, inside the theater, the judges were still talking about Daniel. Howie Mandel shook his head in amazement. "You know, after all these years on the show, I still get surprised," he said. Sofia Vergara nodded. "That wasn't just a performance. That was a story." Heidi Klum smiled warmly. "And the world loves stories like that." But Simon Cowell remained thoughtful. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. "I've seen talent my whole life," Simon said slowly. "But sometimes what moves people isn't perfection. It's honesty." The other judges nodded. Simon looked toward the stage again, where staff were preparing for the next audition. "That boy has something special," he said quietly. Backstage, Daniel sat with his mother in a small waiting room. A production assistant handed him a bottle of water. "Your performance is already trending online," she said with a smile. Daniel blinked in confusion. "What does that mean?" he asked. His mother laughed gently. "It means people all over the world are watching you right now." Daniel's eyes widened. "Really?" The assistant nodded. "Yes. Millions of viewers follow this show." Daniel looked down at the photograph of his father again. For a moment, he imagined his dad sitting somewhere watching the moment unfold. He could almost hear his voice saying the same words he used to repeat every night. "Believe first. Everything else comes later." Later that evening, Daniel and his mother left the theater and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city lights sparkled around them, and people were still talking excitedly about the audition. A few audience members recognized Daniel and waved. "Great job, kid," someone shouted. Daniel smiled shyly. For the first time, he realized that his father's song had reached people he had never even met. But the real surprise came the next morning. Daniel woke up early in the small hotel room the show had provided. His mother was already awake, staring at her phone with wide eyes. "Daniel," she said slowly, "you need to see this." She turned the screen toward him. A video clip of his audition had been posted online. The number of views kept rising every second. Hundreds of thousands. Then millions. People from around the world were sharing his performance. Comments flooded in. His father would be so proud. That song gave me chills. This is why I love talent shows. Daniel sat quietly, overwhelmed. "Do you think Dad would believe this?" he asked. His mother smiled gently. "Oh, I think he already knew." Over the next few days, something incredible began to happen. News outlets began sharing Daniel's story. Radio stations talked about the mysterious song written by a mechanic who believed in his son's future. Music producers began asking questions about the song. And millions of people started waiting for Daniel's next performance. Back at the theater, the judges were preparing for the next round of the competition. Simon walked into the rehearsal room where Daniel was practicing. The boy immediately stood up nervously. "Hello, sir," Daniel said politely. Simon waved his hand. "Relax." Daniel smiled shyly. Simon looked around the room and noticed the old guitar Daniel had brought with him. "Is that your father's?" Simon asked. Daniel nodded. "He fixed it himself," Daniel said proudly. "It used to belong to someone who threw it away." Simon walked closer and examined the guitar. "Well," Simon said thoughtfully, "looks like he knew how to fix more than just instruments." Daniel smiled. Simon sat down across from him. "Next week you'll perform with an orchestra," Simon said. "That's a big moment." Daniel nodded nervously. "I'm a little scared," he admitted. Simon chuckled softly. "Good," he said. Daniel looked confused. "Why good?" he asked. Simon leaned forward. "Because being a little scared means you care," Simon explained. Daniel thought about that for a moment. Simon continued, "The trick isn't to stop being scared. It's to sing anyway." Daniel nodded slowly. That night, he practiced the song again and again. But something had changed. The fear that once made his voice shake had been replaced by determination. He wasn't just singing for a dream anymore. He was singing for a promise. The day of the next performance arrived quickly. The theater was completely full. But this time, the audience already knew Daniel's story. Many people held small signs that read "For Dad." When Daniel stepped onto the stage again, the crowd erupted in applause before he even reached the microphone. Behind him stood a full orchestra. The soft glow of the stage lights surrounded him. Simon watched carefully from the judges' table. Daniel took a deep breath and looked up at the ceiling lights. For a moment, he imagined they were stars. And somewhere beyond those lights, he imagined his father listening. The music began slowly. The orchestra added depth and emotion to the melody his father had written. When Daniel started singing, his voice carried even more confidence than before. The audience listened quietly, completely absorbed in the moment. The story in the lyrics now felt even more powerful. It wasn't just about a father and son anymore. It was about belief. It was about hope. By the time Daniel reached the final chorus, the entire audience was on their feet again. The music swelled. Daniel held the last note with strength and emotion. And when the final chord echoed through the theater, the applause was louder than ever. Simon stood up first. Then the other judges. Then the entire audience. A standing ovation filled the theater. Daniel's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, he wasn't the only one crying. Because everyone watching understood something powerful. Dreams don't belong only to the person who dreams them. Sometimes they travel through generations. Sometimes they wait patiently for someone brave enough to carry them forward. Daniel looked down at the guitar in his hands. And quietly whispered the same words he had said before. "We did it, Dad." And in that moment, it felt like the promise made in a small living room years ago had finally reached the entire world. Because when someone believes in you deeply enough, their voice never truly disappears. It lives on, in the courage they leave behind. The roar of the audience continued for what felt like forever. Even after the orchestra finished the last note, people were still clapping, cheering, and shouting Daniel's name. It was the kind of applause that didn't just fill a theater, it filled a heart. Daniel stood in the center of the stage, overwhelmed. The bright lights above him blurred slightly as tears formed in his eyes. He held the guitar his father had once repaired, gripping it tightly as if it were the last connection to the man who had believed in him before anyone else ever did. At the judges' table, Simon Cowell slowly stood again, still clapping. His expression showed something viewers rarely saw: genuine admiration. Beside him, Heidi Klum wiped a tear from her cheek while smiling warmly. "That boy," she whispered softly, "has something the world needs." The audience eventually began to calm down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Simon leaned toward his microphone. "Daniel," he said. The boy looked up immediately. "Yes, sir?" Simon paused for a moment before speaking again. "You know, this show has had some incredible performers over the years. People with huge voices, unbelievable skills, and massive stage presence." The audience listened closely. "But what you just did," Simon continued, "was something different." Daniel waited nervously. Simon pointed gently toward the guitar in Daniel's hands. "That wasn't just music." He paused again. "That was a promise kept." The crowd erupted into applause again. Daniel felt his chest tighten with emotion. For years, the promise he made to his father had felt impossibly big, too big for someone his age. Yet somehow, standing on this stage, he had done exactly what his father had believed he would do. Backstage, producers and contestants watched the moment unfold on the large monitors. Some contestants who had been preparing nervously for their own auditions now looked inspired instead. One young singer whispered to another contestant, "If he can do that, maybe we can too." Moments like Daniel's didn't just entertain people, they changed the atmosphere for everyone. Eventually the host stepped onto the stage and gently guided Daniel toward the backstage area. The boy waved shyly at the audience before disappearing behind the curtain. The moment he stepped backstage, his mother rushed forward again and hugged him tightly. "You were incredible," she said, barely able to hold back tears. Daniel smiled. "I felt like Dad was listening," he said quietly. She nodded. "I think he was." A